Greetings, everybody. Peter Maravelis here on behalf of City Lights Booksellers and Publishers and the City Lights Foundation. I'd like to welcome you to this special weekend-long program. City Lights, in conjunction with our friends at the Goethe Institute San Francisco, the MIT Press, and the Center for International Security Studies at the University of Sydney, are pleased to present For the Protection of All Beings, an inquiry into advancing technologies and their consequences and possibilities. The program will span over a 2-day period and be comprised of 12 sessions that will include lectures, panel discussions, and workshops. We will be taking a deep dive into the effects of advancing technologies on culture and the environment. So as is customary, at the outset of each event, I'd like to acknowledge we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples. We would like to take this moment to offer respect to those who have come before us as stewards of the land. A few words now about the title of our series. It originates and follows in the conceptual footsteps of City Lights' Journal for the Protection of All Beings, which was a pacifist journal produced in the 1960s by City Lights founder Lawrence Ferlinghetti in conjunction with the poets Michael McClure and David Meltzer. They described the journal as a, quote, visionary and revolutionary review. Their goal was to bring together work that challenged the rigid cultural values that were prevalent at the time. Through poetry, prose, and photography, the journal offered alternative ways of envisioning community and encouraging more equitable and ethical ways of living. The editors were also responding to the nuclear proliferation that the US and the USSR were engaged in at that time. The journal was intended to add to the discussions regarding the many uprisings that were happening around the world at the moment. From the civil rights battles in the US to the movements of liberation on other continents, the goal was to stand as witness to the changing times and offer a call to action. The call to protect all beings stemmed from the notion that there is an interconnectedness that brings all life on the planet together. To ignore this reality is to do so at one's own risk. At present, we find ourselves poised on quite a different kind of precipice than those who lived in the 60s. Much of what they warned us about has actually come to pass. As a species, we are observing numerous crisis points that are global in scope and that can trigger domino effects across the planet. The accelerating development and merging of advancing technologies is bringing us to a crossroads where we have to ask ourselves some fundamental questions about where we are and where we are going as a species. The sessions scheduled to take place over the span of the next 2 days are intended to encourage a deep inquiry into what kind of society we are creating and to offer room for thinking critically about our relationship to technologies and their effects on the environment. We'd like to ask some fundamental questions. Who are technologies built to serve? Who determines the shape and nature of these technologies, and what are their end goals? What are the consequences when a high level of interconnectedness between different technologies advances rapidly with little oversight? And how do we encourage cultural diversity and equity when thinking about new and emerging technologies? What should we be asking of technologies? And where would we like to see them go if they are to be placed in the service of a greater good and not just to satisfy the whims of a privileged class of oligarchs? Essentially, what we are suggesting in the next 2 days is that a more fluid way of thinking about technology is essential. We each need to reassess our relationship to the technologies around us. We need to think about what is needed to make the development of technologies less biased and more equitable for all. We also suggest that we all need to become more proactive in guiding where development is headed. And this only happens with a well-informed and well-connected citizenry. We hope to encourage such vital discussions and offer an updated call to action, encouraging everyone attending to think about how they can influence and participate in the development of public policies around technological development and deployment. We only need to look to what the Writers Guild of America recently did in passing, a new edict that basically says that AI has to be reined in. This is very, very hopeful. So it's our hope to encourage a world where the public can engage with and influence the direction technology is headed, the focus being community and community building, problem solving, and not just profit motive and warfare. With that said, I'd like to welcome now Bettina Wodianka of the Goethe Institute of San Francisco and the co-organizer of this symposium to say a few words. Bettina?
Thank you so much, Peter. I just had an issue here with turning on my volume, but that's perfect now. Thank you so very much. And welcome everybody to our conference for the protection of all beings. I'm Bettina Wodianka, and I'm curating the cultural program at the Goethe Institute San Francisco, the Cultural Institute of the Federal Republic of Germany with a global reach. I can't tell you how excited I am that we are kicking off our program today together with our valued partners, City Lights Booksellers and Publishers, the MIT Press and Center for International Security Studies at the University of Sydney. The program is moreover also part of Sea Change, an initiative implemented by the Goethe Institute together and in close collaboration with Grey Area. It investigates how emerging technologies, when imbued with intentional design, can open up new channels for cross-cultural connection in a changing world. We are here today not merely as attendees, but as custodians of a shared responsibility, a responsibility to safeguard our planet and all the diverse forms of life it sustains, forging a path forward that harmonizes the relentless march of technology with the values of empathy, sustainability, and inclusivity. The Goethe Institute San Francisco is committed to fostering cultural exchange and dialogue, as well as to creating spaces where people can encounter and learn from ideas different from their own. By bringing together brilliant minds, visionary thinkers, and concerned citizens like you, we aim to shed light on the path forward. Over the course of this conference, we will engage in thoughtful discourse, exchange ideas, and collaborate with experts from diverse fields. Together, we will seek innovative solutions that uphold the principles of justice and equity. Our shared future is not guaranteed. We need to build it together. How do art, philosophy, and interdisciplinary approaches contribute to our understanding of technology's role in shaping our world? And how can emerging technologies further new approaches and help us to navigate through the turbulent geopolitical circumstances we are facing? What principles and guidelines should guide the development and use of these technologies, and how can we advance technologies that serve, for example, as instruments of healing? It was in that very journal for the protection of all beings where an advocate for communal living and ecological activism wrote, quote, "The most radical technological advances may be those that empower us to recognize and protect the intrinsic value of all beings." These words, spoken in the 1960s, continue to resonate profoundly with us today. Before I turn it over to Peter again, let me once again point out that we are deeply grateful for that collaboration. Especially to you, Peter, I want to thank the whole team of City Lights and the Goethe Institute San Francisco. Please allow me to name my closest partners in crime here from the local institute, Noemi Jangiro and Imogen Kakushki. Thanks go also out to Jonathan Keats, who has been involved in planning this conference from the very beginning on. Thank you for all the efforts you invested into making this possible. Our discussions together with Peter have been a true pleasure, delight, and enrichment for me, and they gave me the opportunity to learn and grow steadily. And thank you, last but not least, dear audience, for tuning in. You're always welcome to actively participate in the conversations. Please also join us for the in-person portion of the conference if you happen to be around in the Bay Area, and please find us. We always love to connect, to meet, and to get to know you. And so I'm turning it over to you, Peter, again.
Thank you so much, Bettina. And truly, this began as a discussion, and it continues and will continue after this weekend. And, it's been really such a pleasure working with Goethe over the years, and especially for this particular event. So thank you. I really want to, actually welcome Jairus with us here today, who is no stranger to City Lights. He's going to be part of the very first session of our weekend-long festival. His session is called Savage Ecology, War and Geopolitics at the End of the World. Such a delight to have him back in our orbit. We've hosted him in the past. He's someone whose work we've respected and greatly over the years. He's Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of the Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies at the University of Hawaii in Manoa. In his talk, he'll be offering us an ecological theory of geopolitics that argues that contemporary global crises are better understood when considered within the larger history of international politics, infusing international relations with theoretical interventions of fields ranging from new materialism to political theory. Professor Grove shows us how political violence is the principal force behind climate change, mass extinction, slavery, genocide, and other catastrophes. He examines a variety of subjects, from improvised explosive devices to drones to artificial intelligence and brain science, to outline how geopolitics is really the violent pursuit of a way of living that comes at the expense of others. There's going to be time for questions at the end of his talk, so please do post them in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard. We're also going to be posting links with which you may purchase Professor Grove's book, which is of the same title as this talk. So please join us now in offering a warm welcome to Jairus Grove.
Thank you, Peter. I just want to say thank you to City Lights and to the Goethe Institute. So Bettina, thank you, and to James Derderian at CISIS. You know, City Lights is one of those like few sacred places left where hustlers, tramps, poets, and philosophers have always been welcome to think about ideas, even when others didn't think their ideas were worth thinking. And I think that's it's something to protect, it's something to cherish, and it's something to support. So it means a great deal to me to be here. This is sort of inspired by the book. I think the talk I kind of came up with a name for because it's a bit embedded in this particular moment, and it's called Life in an Age of Charismatic Machines. And part of what I'm trying to think, and I'll go through, are a series of reflections on what it is that makes our particular technological epoch different, right? Because everything's technological. One could argue that the advent of language was a certain kind of technology, one that was actually quite beautiful. The advent of the thumb, right? Our evolutionary history is no less technological, and that it was all about how to interface with the world, right? It was different ways of everything from building homes to making tools, to changing the ways that our bodies consumed calories through fire, right? There's sort of no history of human history that is not a technological history. That being said, that doesn't mean that every technological movement is one that is necessary, nor one that is practical, important, or valuable. And I think trying to figure that out is actually quite difficult. We often end up in places where we're supposedly for or against technology, or we are to understand the technical as something distinctive from the arts, etc. But the paintbrush is no less sophisticated than the iPhone. The question is what kind of worlds each one of these techniques makes. So I'm going to try to go through what I think is about this moment, which is rife with a certain kind of madness for technology. We're having this talk at the moment that Israel is promising to devastate its adversaries amongst Hamas, for which it will draw little distinction between those who merely live in Gaza and those for which it is fighting in Gaza. A time when our Democratic president, who was meant to deliver us from the tyranny of Donald Trump, is extending the border wall that so perfectly characterized the way that fear and sadism can come about to govern a nation. So I think the stakes couldn't be higher, and at the same time, sometimes it seems like our victories are a bit thin. So here's how it starts. Number one, the double click. The double click is a term that Bruno Latour introduced us to at the end of his life. He described it as that moment where, as you're on the internet and you're moving your cursor around almost seamlessly as if it's an extension of your finger, a link shows up for you and you click on it. But the thing about the double click, when you follow the link, precisely the way that that sort of hyperlink works is for you to forget or almost be incapable of knowing what came between it. How did you get from point A to point B? Why did you choose that particular link, right? We have a particular kind of technology which by definition breeds a kind of forgetting and a kind of thoughtlessness. And so like Peter, I want to begin with what makes it possible for this talk to occur. You all received an Eventbrite link. You registered your name, your data, your information, your IP address, and you clicked on it to begin. But in doing so, both of us, myself and yourself included, somehow whizzed past the fact that I'm in Hawaii, an outpost of the US military, which would only exist if not for the fact that an oligarch of families convinced the United States government that there was a crisis happening that they needed to be saved from, and sent the US Marines in to help overthrow the rightful leaders, the monarch, the queen of Hawaii, right? That is the condition of possibility for us to even have this conversation, is that the US military enforced the production of our 50th state. This sort of process, I think, then also includes the fact that to get from here to there, what do I have to cross through? A vast network of actual cables, right? It's not ethereal. It's not the sort of internet as we often imagine it. It's hardwired across the bottom of the ocean. It's dropped, it's maintained, it's surveilled by NSA submarines, by Chinese underwater drones. It's listened in upon, no less than it was during the XYZ affair, which accelerated World War I. Once we arrive in California, we arrive to settlement again, a state that only exists because the United States was able to build an intercontinental railroad that would connect the two ends through the brutal process of destruction and elimination and continued process of extermination of Native peoples. That process then gets redoubled and finds its synecdoche, its miniature, in the Tenderloin of San Francisco, where violence, police brutality, the desperation and also despair of drug use and homelessness find themselves as a kind of wart or eyesore to the Silicon Valley vision that would like to think about San Francisco as some place to pass through easily, so that one could double click from one's office to one's favorite restaurant or sushi bar in an Uber without ever having to see the costs of that production. The double click becomes not just a way in which we hypermediate or connect the various sources of information, communication, technology, and interface, but also the ways those come to actually structure the way that we encounter the world. Just think about the way that the double click of your Uber ride puts your phone in front of your face, right? To obscure the way that you would want to see, the way that you would want to think, what else could possibly happen? Instead, who you encounter is who has been engineered to be encountered. A kind of forgetlessness, a kind of thoughtlessness, and one that becomes habit. At the beginning of the 20th century, there was a great debate between Walter Lippmann and John Dewey. Lippmann proposed that the increasing complexity of life was going to bring an end to the possibility of democracy. That people just couldn't possibly become experts in all the things that they would need to be experts on to actually make good political judgments about the world, right? This was his argument for why, in particular, foreign policy and foreign affairs were overwhelming the sort of capacity of someone who had to work every day. And so we need more and more and more expertise at the level of government decision-making. It was a terrifying view, and one that, while he was quite vocal about, also came with a bit of sadness that somehow we had lost that possibility. In response, John Dewey said, no, in the publicans' problems, we could find ways in which we could express good judgment. There was nothing about the nature of political judgment which got harder simply because the world became more complicated. The world had always been complicated. The world had always been more than any one person could know. And that was precisely the process of democratic contestation. For Dewey, what would make that possible was both the way that education would come to be a site of building that kind of literacy for our modern world, but also the way that education would build a kind of trust or civic capacity for collective action. I think when we look back on that debate, what we see is that the double click is a kind of processing, a kind of technology, a way of interfacing with information rather than knowledge, information or data rather than wisdom, that is meant to bypass that possibility for that collective civic space. Number 2, life in a black box. In Technics and Civilization, Lewis Mumford, one of the great philosophers of technology at the beginning of the 20th century, lamented that we were losing our capacity to even understand what these great techniques could do. His first example was that of the automobile. The automobile offered immense possibilities for travel, for the lightening of loads for both animals and humans, that is non-human animals and human animals alike, and that it was a potentially interesting possibility. He said the problem, though, was how immediately the sort of inventiveness and creativity of the car was followed immediately by the enclosure of the engine. He thought this wasn't merely a practical interest. Instead, enclosing the engine was a way of alienating each individual from the possibility of understanding what it was the car was doing, that it was literally an explosive device hurtling us towards one another. Right? With each passing generation, we move from those who could build a car from scratch to fewer and fewer that even know how to change their oil, to new electric cars who are meant to deliver us from climate change, for which working on them is an intellectual property violation that can land you in court. This loss, not just of the right of repair, but another kind of forgetfulness of knowledge, of understanding of the way that things work, is not just a problem of the automobile. The increasing technologies, the advances of artificial intelligence, large language models, which I'll speak of later, vast communication technologies and networks debilitate us in the way that Jasbir-Puar distinguishes between debility and disability. Disabilities are those things which are designed for us not to be able to interface. Debility are when those designs become a way to purposefully exclude and marginalize our capacities for agency and action. All of these networks, these forms of communication, these roots of double clicking, enable certain kinds of connections, while particularly they debilitate others. They debilitate that possibility for collective understanding. They debilitate, in many ways, the possibilities for the creation of wisdom and knowledge. And they debilitate the ways in which we once learned to distinguish between language, wisdom, and noise. These forms become, I think, one of the great challenges in our capacity to understand not just what we could do with technologies, but what technologies do to us. How much less frequently do we read a story we weren't looking for? How much less frequently do we come across a book we didn't expect to want? How much less frequently are our choices in the art we consume not already driven or steered by something else? And how rarely do we have any understanding of what the kinds of algorithmic logics or reasons are behind that steering? We live in a black box. It's no longer the black box of the car, it's the black box of the cell phone, it's the black box of the computer, it's the black box of the hiring and firing decisions where we work, it's the black box of the decisions to take teachers out of the classroom or include teachers, it's the black box of assessing risk for when we do and don't go to war. It's the black box of the very process of political action and political decision-making. Number 3, memory without conscience, action without judgment. I want to talk about a very specific technology, which seems quite simple, but I think is quite emblematic. And that's the emergence in the 1920s, having been invented in the 1880s, of the rap sheet. The rap sheet is a fascinating document. The rap sheet is a record of arrest and prosecution. A record of arrest and prosecution. It was merely a sheet of paper. But in the 1920s, the International Brotherhood and the Fraternal Order of Police began to circulate this format, right? A sheet of paper, which at the top had a person's name. And the next section had blanks to fill out their physical description. And then had a series of blanks and numbers with dates that could be filled in for each possible arrest or prosecution. With a simple sheet of paper and a kind of format for how one ought to think about the relationship between policing and crime, we moved from an era in which the police were empowered to respond to an event to one in which their job was to surveil or suspect the recurrence of criminality. Think about the way that that simple transformation from individual acts of criminality to a pattern of crime underwrites the very logic of white supremacy, police brutality, racial profiling, the quote-unquote logic of recidivism, and the permanent construction of a criminal underclass. Without those records, which began at each individual police station, and then were spread around the country by the emerging Federal Bureau of Investigation, and then standardized so they could be shared via phone call and fax machine, until finally databases, both state, local, national, and international, could find ways to understand each individual as a potential criminal premised upon their past decisions. Something else happened, another kind of double click. It was no longer a question of judgment or a question of conscience on whether or not someone was guilty. It was an accumulation of something we called facts, which is to say evidence that could speak for itself. In 1979, or 1981 rather, James Baldwin was asked to go investigate the so-called child murders in Atlanta. These murders had taken place between 1979 and 1981, and they would be blamed on a single Black man, for whom two other crimes were certainly something he had committed. In what became the book, The Evidence of Things Unseen, James Baldwin reported that what was clear was not that the man on trial was somehow guilty of all these murders. It was that the man on trial became the receptacle for over 400 pieces of so-called physical evidence. His relationship to that physical evidence, what that physical evidence meant, somehow was insignificant in comparison to the mere weight or statistical number of pieces of evidence. The process then became not a way of finding someone guilty, but finding someone capable, quote unquote, of over 20 child murders because of the past murder of two adults. Something happened there. It wasn't the reason of inductive logic. It was not the positivism of gathered data to make an inference for which one can move forward on. It was a kind of resonance between a data set, all of the evidence, and a rap sheet, a future trajectory which must be true because of a past set of behaviors. And the leap over it short-circuited by the logic of white supremacy and the inability for Atlanta to come to grips with the fact that so many Black children could die, that it could be so unsafe to be Black and alive in a city that proposed to be modern. Memory without conscience, action without judgment. Number 4, can you wear a hat on someone else's behalf? In 1929, Wittgenstein wrote in one of his notebooks, "No one can think for me in the way that no one can don a hat on my behalf." It's a fascinating line that he turned into an ethics at the introduction of the Philosophical Investigations. He said in its preface, "I should not like my writing to spare other people the trouble of thinking." For me, what is most disturbing about large language models, about the fact that AI or other forms of production and creation can be automated is not that they somehow intrude upon our ability to create. They certainly do so from a financial perspective because they are cheaper than we are. They don't require retirement. They don't require care. They don't require childcare. They don't require all the things that we need. It's more that it tricks us into believing that what we want from creation is its product. That what's fascinating is that a large language model can produce exactly the story we want and exactly the style we wanted. That it could edit even our initial thoughts into something that was simpler, easier to be read by somebody else. It mistakes the process of creation as something that is only its instrumental or utility for the making of products, and loses precisely that something like philosophy, which Wittgenstein was talking about, was meant to be done, not read and consumed. The invention of philosophy was a process, something to do on a daily basis, the necessity of self-reflection, the possibility of coming to grips with the, at times, crushing brutality of our mortal condition. That to think was to therapeutically deal with those problems so that we could learn to be kinder to ourselves and kinder to others. We could learn to make meaning in a world where meaning couldn't be made for us. What LLMs present us with is another kind of double click, where the thing that we need, the thing that we want, the thing that's been demanded us at work can merely be produced at the mere will of something else. These AI don't become collaborators, they don't become interlocutors, they become another way for us to forget the very capacities for labor and creation that make us. I'm reminded of a recent book written by Jeff Tweedy, the lead singer of Wilco, which is about the fact that everyone has in them, according to him, a song. The fact that there are greater rock bands out there, the fact that you can download any piece of music you would ever possibly think of off of your iPhone, doesn't change the fact that writing a song, performing a song, even covering someone else's song is radically different than the consumption of a song. It makes in somebody the possibility of connecting the world. It invites others to join that world with them. You can't wear a hat on somebody else's behalf. The promise of artificial intelligence is not the promise of a better world. It's the promise of a world without us. Number 5, who programs the programmers? In 1948, Norbert Wiener, the mathematician who coined the term cybernetics and first understood how quickly complexity and intelligence could emerge in artificial systems as a result of feedbacks and the sort of gathering of data, immediately went to the AFL-CIO, which was the largest union at the time, to tell them how concerned he was about the possibility of mass automation. They were overcome. They, one, I think, didn't believe that it was possible that such a thing could happen. And they, two, didn't really understand how quickly it could take place. Many people in the 1960s and 70s characterized Norbert Wiener as a kind of fanatic, as if he were overly concerned about something that wouldn't happen. But he had 2 reasons to be concerned, which I think we haven't taken seriously, in part because what we were looking for is a world where everyone would lose their jobs in some sort of catastrophic mass event, not the chronic loss of jobs, the chronic loss of fulfilling forms of life that we actually have now seen. Those 2 were that it would create slavery without guilt. His concern was the desire for artificial intelligence, the desire for automated labor, was the desire for a kind of unearned luxury, a life without consequences. For him, contained in it was the very same cruelty and sadism which had animated the Middle Passage and the period of chattel slavery that had wrecked the possibility of another America. Not because AI was already in the capacity to feel pain, but precisely that it offered the same kind of seduction, of subordination and protection without any consequence. The second was that it would radically change the nature of accountability and political action. And for this, I think we should really take a moment and a real pause before we double click to the excitement that we may have a 3-day working week. For those machines which do not yet have the consciousness to feel solidarity with our existence, the possibility of striking diminishes with each capacity that becomes automated. The only way in which direct action short of war or insurrection has ever produced change in political history has been our ability to take labor away from those who would take our dignity away from us. With each other process that we can't access, with each other process more durable to our potential sabotage, we lose our relationship in the thermodynamics of politics to remove our energy from their necessity. And with that, we lose the most fundamental capacity of democratic accountability and action. Demonstration and representation will not be sufficient in an age in which we barely appear on the radar. Number 6, charismatic machines, cunning and persuasion. The problem with LLMs is not that they're brilliant, it's that they're incredibly satisfying. For those of you who have played them, I spent 2 weeks at the Swedish Defense Institute in June, trying to figure out all the things they could do. What was clear is the more you interacted with them, the more they seemed real. The more information you gave them, the more information they could give you back that felt like a conversation. What's important about that is that that was not because of their accuracy. It didn't require that they have facts. They function precisely on the risk of persuasion and seduction themselves. The more real they sound, the aesthetic that they produce, and their ability to create narratives, to collate information into something coherent and consistent, something pleasurable, something interesting, compelling. That relationship is not one of intelligence, as we like to think about artificial intelligence, but one of biomimetics. Machines are reaching the capacity to enter into a mimetic relationship with us, such that we fill in the gaps. We think we know what they mean. This isn't unique to machines. We do this all the time together in our conversations. We don't know precisely what's in our other person's head, our interlocutor. We fill in those gaps. The difference is those interlocutors can hold us accountable. They can challenge us. They can interrupt us to find the ways in which we have, in some sense, projected ourselves onto them. How many arguments, how many possibilities of relationships have both ended and begun in those moments of illegibility or those moments of misrecognition? Differently, though, LLMs are designed to optimize. So those moments of discomfort, those moments of illegibility are fixed. They become something of an error that can be removed from the equation. To constantly optimize to produce exactly what you want is to build a generation of imaginary friends for children to produce a kind of profound narcissism, where our pleasure or satisfaction with the world is produced precisely by which the world produces what we wanted or what we expected, to produce, again, more fear for what could do otherwise. I think these kinds of possibilities are the things that scare me about this new age. Number 7, devouring difference and insatiable appetite. LLMs and artificial intelligence based upon the large data sets that they eat are the ultimate homogenization machines. In my book, I talk about the fact that geopolitics for me, the last 500 years, its violence has not just been premised upon the lethal force that is inflicted, but on the fact that that lethal force was in the pursuit of the creation of what Peter Sloterdijk called a global user space, where things don't have sharp corners, which things are not illegible, things are not unpredictable, and they all function and interface smoothly together. That productive search for utility has, of course, been the very logic and reason behind genocide, the extermination of native peoples, the forcible modernization of agrarian peoples, the devastation and destruction of non-human animal environments, the eradication of so-called predator species that were a danger or a threat to the normal order of the world. Wolves, cougars, sharks. These are the things that must be eliminated. That is built into the logic of a large language model. It devours difference. It devours inscrutability in a search for optimization. It is the reflection of 500 years of homogenization. Number 8, Zambia, 550,000 BC, waiting for intelligence. I struggle with the excitement that artificial intelligence poses us for the first time an encounter with intelligence. Since John von Neumann first sort of posited the idea of the computer as a brain, as soon as Turing, in his famous 1950 paper in Mind, sort of thought that every thought in its complexity must be based of simpler thoughts, which could be in some way calculated, we became enamored with the idea of encountering something of our either equal or superior to us. Another way of thinking about that is that the same sort of thrill that we get at the possibility of UFOs, of aliens from another planet, it's a thrill that we may someday cease to be this lonely species, the only species to hear the call of being, to see reason in action. In Zambia, in 550,000 BCE, they discovered a house made out of Lincoln logs or shaped wood built near water. They were not humans that built it. Almost 200,000 years before Homo sapiens, there were other upright mammals building houses, making tools, having families, and thinking about the possibility of community. This is not the first time we've been on the precipice of encountering intelligence. In fact, quite the opposite. It's another moment where we ignore the fact of how many times humans have encountered other intelligences and pass them over for a kind of narcissistic reflection of ourselves. How many times did we ignore Denovians or ignore Neanderthals? And for how long have we ignored the intelligence of dolphins, whales, primates, and even slime mold? The moment of artificial intelligence is a moment of captivation, which terrifies me in the ways in which we'll forget the world filled with intelligence that we've made so little ground in trying to understand. In the 1960s, 2 events happened that capture this for me. The first was John Lilly, who sadly both helped invent the Kubark torture manual and also invented the isolation tank for self-reflection. He began work on what was called the Janus Project. It was meant to be a device that would allow humans to speak to dolphins and dolphins to speak to humans. Unfortunately, because it was funded by the US Navy, it became the bedrock of the US Navy attack mammal program, which used marine mammals in combat and for investigation, patrol, and other forms of reconnaissance. Rather than developing the possibility to have a kind of interspecies dialogue. For Lilly, the ability to talk to a dolphin meant potentially the possibility to see how others saw us, to get outside the anthropocentric circle and engage in a kind of philosophy that was bigger than our own event or existence. Nearly the same year, Jacques Cousteau built an underwater city to demonstrate that humans could live in a totally other world, that we could encounter other intelligences. For him, and some of the most exciting being those of squid and octopus. When presented to the United Nations, there was a great deal of excitement that immediately evaporated because, of course, America had put a man on the moon. The shift outwards towards space was a shift away from the fact that our world was teeming with aliens, teeming with new possibilities of encounter. That possibility for me is again occluded by the hope that a fully automated, a fully intelligent future is somehow just within our grasp, and the necessary deliverance from the catastrophes that we have unleashed through climate change, the loss of species, the domination of peoples that we also did not judge as equals or intelligent. Number 9, Requiem for a Dying Civilization. The last book that George Bataille wrote or published was a series of lectures on the discovery of cave paintings in France. These paintings represented a moment, he said, where humans did not distinguish themselves from animals. These human-animal figures, which were often all over the walls, were possibilities for a kind of humanity that didn't take place. That this was a kind of fork in the road. Instead, paintings became the basis for representation. Representation became the process of language, and language became a kind of scientific endeavor of representation and classification to divide the world up into parts that could be mastered or used in the pursuit of the development of humanity. For Bataille, this was the road to the atom bomb. But the road not taken was the possibility of a species of poets, painters, explorers. But the exploration wouldn't be the domination of new spaces and their settlement, but the exploration of what was in our minds, which we had to paint on walls because we couldn't communicate it to those around us. A desire to share that exploration, not a desire to master that exploration. For me, the possibility of a truly radical artificial intelligence, for radical technological innovation, are not those things which alleviate the process of thinking, the process of making, and the process of doing from our daily lives. There are those which could connect us to other possibilities and other kinds of intelligence. Anything short of that, I believe, merely greases the skids of the process of global homogenization. I feel like we are at a crossroad again. What the next atom bomb will be is unclear. What is clear is how many people would benefit precisely by our inability to hold government, warfare, violence, technology, and capital accountable. That, for me, is what we face in an age of charismatic machines. Thank you.
Thank you, Jairus. Wow. We are beginning to receive some comments in the chat. Let's see if I can cull some from here. Lisa says, making connections, the explosion of unregulated specific safety regulations not in existence yet of carbon capture and the storage systems with pipelines ripping up the agricultural Midwest to transport highly pressurized supercritical fluid carbon dioxide across states to be pumped into underground toxic waste dumps in other states. Much of what's spoken of thus far overlaps with this activity by the well-connected and powerful who have little to no interest in environment, climate, public safety, but are seeking enormous tax credits to do so. Quote unquote, toothpaste out of a tube.
Yeah, this is the same reason why I have so much, cynicism and doubt when people talk about the promise of AI. I have a very similar cynicism and doubt in the book about the promise of the Green Revolution. The capital intensive and technologically focused, and by technological, I mean high technology, large infrastructures for dealing with climate change, I think are justified on the logic that big problems need big solutions, right? As if we need a solution that is as sophisticated as the problem. Carbon capture is a great example of that. So is geoengineering, right? These are massive, capital-intensive infrastructure projects, which will, of course, produce political interests around who gets to build them, who gets to benefit from them, that will, because of that, think about how to distribute risk in ways which will shield the companies that build them, right? Because they won't be built by the state, right? We're past public infrastructure where we could actually hold the state accountable. The state will find contractors to build those systems, and those contractors will use the dual protection of both being a corporation and the way that sovereign immunity by the state will be lent to them as an incentive for building the infrastructure. And I think that's incredibly dangerous. Yep. I'll also say that the very logic of the pipeline has a very distinctive history in the de-democratization of the United States. One of my favorite books is by Timothy Mitchell. It's called Carbon Democracy. And he makes the point that we shifted to oil in the pipeline, not just in the Middle East, but even here in the United States, precisely not because it was cheaper or it was better than coal, but because it didn't require hundreds of thousands of unionized coal miners to move it around. That interlocking solidarity between coal miners, those who ran the railroads, and the fact that without them you couldn't keep the lights on was a permanent threat to political elitism, right? In the case of the UK, this is the reason why the Minister of Interior, who at the time was none other than Churchill, changed the energy infrastructure of the British Navy from coal to oil, so we could crush the coal miners in Wales, right? It was a way of crushing the strike. Moving into the Middle East was the next ancillary benefit. You could take away the destructive character of digging up fossil fuels. You could take away the possibility of citizens being involved, and you could double click again, where you didn't have to think about where your energy came from. It came from somewhere else. And so Mitchell very persuasively argues that as much as we've been taught to hate coal, coal was better for democracy than oil ever has been. So I think the pipeline is just, it's one of those infrastructures that is by definition, like Mumford said, of enclosing the engine of the car, a way of forgetting, right? Let's forget the carbon. Let's forget the danger. Let's forget the communities where that carbon will spill. And it's not just in the Midwest, it will be across federal lands, most of which are Native American lands, because those will be the areas where they have the easiest time using their capability to take space for pipelines. And for me, that's not an exit from the last 500 years of ecological destruction. That is precisely that process. So I really appreciate the question, but I think like these are things which I think on the left, we really are going to have to struggle to find a language for, because it will feel like, and they will have the counter argument that we are fighting against climate change. They will paint us as being on the side of climate denialists when we oppose those large systems. But I absolutely think they're as dangerous as the very thing that they're trying to solve.
Yeah. Kuhan makes a comment, a double click seems to be the ultimate expression of blissful, ignorant colonial consumption.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is, but I think we have to think about what that is, which is like, technologies are extraordinarily important for creating habits. I want us to start thinking about settler colonialism, not just as the horror show when we sit in the cavalry, but also the horror show of building a habit where you didn't have to think about it, right? This is one of those things which, you know, I think settler colonial studies has done such a good job of, is trying to remind us that, right, settler colonialism isn't an event, it's a structure. And I think what we'd want to push even further is it's not just a structure, it's an infrastructure. So what are the processes so we don't notice it, right? Freeways, right? Freeways were how we made redlining permanent between white and black communities, right? Urbanization was the way in which Native American lands were put in destitute places where quote unquote thriving cities were replaced. Suburbs were encouraged and supported when we shifted our nuclear strategy from targeting other military targets to targeting cities. Why? Because the same person, James Conant, who theorized that shift from counter-force to counter-value targeting, meaning targeting each other's cities rather than targeting each other's military structure to stabilize deterrence, was the same person who fought tooth and nail as president of Harvard against busing, against integration, because he saw value in the all-white suburbs that would survive the nuclear first strikes, right? We literally built an infrastructure of nuclear reason and nuclear strategy as the ability to produce Black genocide, right? So I think the double click is it's all of these processes of design and engineering, which have a logic to themselves, which seems quite practical and makes a great deal of sense, but makes too much sense to too many other people, right? Thinking about the other kinds of sense that it makes, I think, is really valuable, really important.
as we're waiting for more questions, I'm curious to have your thoughts about the Writers Guild of America, like addressing AI.
Yeah, I think it's really important. We've been having a similar set of conversations as educators and as professors. It's so clear that AI doesn't have to be as good as a human. It merely has to be good enough that people will settle for it. And then the capital differential is so vastly different, people will settle. So don't be surprised if you have kids that during natural disasters, when you complain about your school, when schools need more resources, they're going to offer you an AI platform to get your education. And I would say in the same way that the Writers Guild is insisting that the creation of art is something we ought to protect for creators, we also need to think about protecting things like education, therapy, and caregiving, right? These things are not valuable because they produce a particular endpoint. Education isn't valuable because it produces a job. Therapy isn't valuable because it means you can go to work and not be interrupted by depression. These things are valuable because they produce the very civic communities and the very relations and the very possibilities of empathy and interaction that Dewey thought was the last defense of democracy, right? And for me, like, that should be the frontline question of unions. They should have listened in 48 to Wiener. They didn't, because they didn't have the imagination. They also didn't think they had the power. But now, whether we have the power or not, like, for me, this is the last fight. Otherwise, it's just too easy, right? We're too difficult to manage, us workers, as compared to even mediocre AI.
We're coming up on the top of the hour. I was wondering if you have any parting thoughts, especially in relation to people in the audience who may want to participate more in this discussion, may even want to become involved in shaping the public conversation.
Yeah, I think now is the time to turn out to your city councils. Now is the time to turn out to your school boards. Now is the turnout to the state legislature. We should be looking for all the places where we're trying to phase people out, where we're trying to replace these sort of opportunities or optimize things from policing to garbage pickup to writing to teaching, right? There's not going to be a shortage of places to fight. And I think showing up for those people, right? Showing up for where we will automate first is absolutely essential. The other is these things will happen technologically, meaning the ways in which we will be able to sabotage, the ways we will be able to strike, the ways we'll be able to create other possibilities of technology will not be contrary to technology. There'll be other routes in the evolution of techniques. So I think we also have to partner with those engineers and those technical thinkers and visionaries that, unlike Elon Musk, who want to hit eject on this planet and eject on women and eject on Black people and eject on everything else, we need to find those who see in a certain kind of technical capability the possibility for intimacy and connection and community. I think short of that, right, the best we can hope for is sort of screaming at the dying light.
Yeah. I can take one more question. Kuhan asks, what do you think of the 2020 Federal Artificial Intelligence Act?
Oh, gosh. I'll tell a story, and I won't say exactly where I think the act will go, but I was hired as a consultant at one point in time by a law firm. Their client wanted to know if they were engaged in insider trading. And the reason why they want to know if they're engaged in insider trading is that they were using AI to scrape the internet to determine their investment strategies. And the AI was so successful, it was reverse engineering insider knowledge without having been told it. And it was very successful. And they wanted to make sure that not knowing that they were trading on information that was inside information was sufficient to protect them in the case of a lawsuit. I didn't finish the project. They terminated it midway through because when they met with the regulators didn't know how to check their own email. We don't have the regulatory knowledge or processes. We have so undermined the state of regulatory capability that I'm not sure what that bill could possibly do in a world where we have a party that is hell-bent on sabotaging any effort. In the 1990s, we used to have something called the Office of Technology Assessment. It was incredibly important. It was under the congressional oversight. It investigated not just what technologies we needed, but what technologies were better as opposed to others, meaning that the best technology, what they called best available technology, was not the same thing as the highest level of technology. In fact, sometimes quite the opposite. It wasn't perfect, but it was at least a place where that conversation and that sort of foresight was legally required. When Newt Gingrich couldn't obliterate the rest of government that he wanted to because he didn't have the power he wanted in Congress, because he had jurisdiction over the OTA, that was what the contract in America successfully killed. It says something to me that we no longer have a foresight division of the government where we would have a democratic conversation, not over the most advanced technology, but that technology which might actually be the most democratic. For me, like, that's the kind of thing that we have to struggle for now.
I think we can sneak in one more. Jonathan asks, on the topic of utility optimization, is there a need to rethink or expand utility as a concept, say for long-term scales, or is rejection the root?
Lately, for me, it feels like rejection, sabotage is what we need. Even in the way that we think about democracy, how often are we arguing to sidestep democracy because it's too slow or it's too hard or it's not producing the outcome or utility we want, as if the point of democracy was its output and not the way that it built a participation amongst the people who would be involved in it. And I think the same thing is true of art. What does it mean to say that AI can produce better poetry when what we want is to live in a world with poets, right? So I think needing to cultivate almost what I would call a concept of the useless, right? Which is to say things that are valuable simply because they exist, not because of what we can do with them, right? If we can't cultivate a kind of love or a kind of almost sacredness for those types of not just behaviors, but forms of life, then I don't see a way to push back against a world where optimization will always seem very, very basic. Are we all fed? As if it matters if we can't eat the food that we loved growing up. If we're all housed, but it doesn't matter that we can't be in the place where we think our people came from and literally made the world as an interspecies relationship, right? Those kinds of questions, I don't think will ever translate into instrumentality or into utility in a way that doesn't benefit power. And living on the front lines with a people like the Hawaiians who are fighting for just the most basic dignity to hold on to things like mountains where their universe sprung forth, right? Volcanoes that gave birth to the place that they call home, right? Like that's not a question of utility, right? It's a question of meaning. And I think the problem with utility, it always sidesteps the fact that meaning doesn't make itself. The insight of Nietzschean nihilism is that we do live in a meaningless world, which is precisely why we have the obligation to fill it with meaning, right? Meaning isn't already made. And like philosophy, you can't do it for anybody else. You can't wear a hat on their behalf. And so I think utility has borne itself out, and it's time to get back to that cave.
I think that is a perfect place to put a little bookmark on the conversation. I don't want to say end the conversation because I think we'll be right back here sooner than later. Jairus Grove, such a pleasure being back in your orbit after a long while.
Thanks everybody else who came. I hope to hear from you. My email is easy to find. Please reach out. So.
Yeah, your insights and your scholarship are really greatly appreciated. I also want to thank everyone in the audience. Thanks to our co-sponsors, Goethe Institute San Francisco, the MIT Press, the Center for International Security Studies at the University of Sydney. Bettina, I cannot say enough. She has been such a wonderful partner. Nomi Jangiru, also at the Goethe, who knows a good thing when she sees it. Imogen, also Jonathan Keats, who has really served as such a great inspiration in the planning and the philosophy of the programming for this weekend. I need to also mention James Durdurian, who has over the years been such a great influence and an ally. Really want to give out great love to Jose Tarielba for his technical prowess down in Sydney. At the MIT Press, David Olson, for all of his tireless effort in arranging people's schedules and making helpful suggestions. Really, thanks to all of you, last but not least, for helping complete the circle. This event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, continuing the legacy of our founder, the late Lawrence Ferlinghetti, by fostering an active engagement with books and literary culture. Thank you all. Once again, we look forward to seeing you very shortly